One.
Well, good morning, fans of all things Leonard Peikoff. Is this the right day for you to be here? This is the right day for you to be here. We are keeping it real. Keeping it real with Dr. Leonard Peikoff. You know, we've been going through this collection, and we have discussed everything from politics to sexuality to objectivism. Today, James, you've lined something special up for us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing outstandingly well. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing well, and I'm excited because on the Ayn Rand Center UK, one of the great things about this channel, and I don't mean to get into, who's the real objectivist and who's the most faithful, but I don't know any better place to celebrate the ideas and the life of Leonard Peikoff than here. In fact, after the show, don't do it now, but after the show, I have posted a set of links to some of the amazing events the ARCUK, the Ayn Rand Center UK, has had celebrating Leonard Peikoff, including his appearance. This is a retired philosopher, but no, he has appeared on the ARCUK several times. Love that. And you have picked out for us today from the collection of Leonard Peikoff's podcast answers in the book, Keeping It Real. You have picked out some great questions that'll bring out some of the, not just the best of Leonard Peikoff, but fun facts as well. And I know because you had the privilege of studying directly with Leonard Peikoff, that you will have insights above and beyond anything I can say. So I'm going to jump right to question number one. I even brought my espresso here because I know you will have much to say. But the first question was, well, how did you get your start as a philosopher? And Leonard Peikoff answered, well, I grew up in a very non-intellectual environment. No one I knew was interested in ideas, and I did not even do very much reading when I was younger. I did not even know there was such a subject as philosophy. I'm going to pause in reading Leonard Peikoff's answer there because, and I think we've talked about this before, it's interesting that we don't always remember, me, Robert Nasir, you, James Valliant, what it was like in our lives before we encountered the writings of Ayn Rand. And some of us have read, in my case, Nietzsche or fiction writers who were also interested in philosophy, including some who were interested in Ayn Rand's philosophy, like Robert Heinlein. But do you remember before discovering philosophy, you had that yearning sense of there are big questions I want to answer, but how ignorant were we before we came across these ideas?
Right. In a sense, Dr. Leonard Peikoff had a good upbringing in one sense. He didn't have a lot of bad ideas to fight against. He came from a family of Jewish background, and he grew up in, Western Canada, not exactly the heart of civilization. His father was a prominent physician, a surgeon. He actually wrote a book about medical practice himself. So his father was, no dummy, but he wasn't exactly a culturally educated man. His mother was a band leader, knew music, led music bands and orchestras all over North America sometimes. And I had a privilege to meet her in Leonard Peikoff's kitchen one night, a very interesting lady. But it wasn't what I would call, you have to agree with Dr. Peikoff, it wasn't a terribly intellectual environment where they discussed cultural issues or philosophical issues. So Dr. Peikoff was barely aware of those kind of issues when he was growing up, in Winnipeg, Canada, back in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, he writes, I've written many times, of course, I've met Ayn Rand in 1951 and put the issue of the moral and the practical to her. I was totally overwhelmed by that meeting. You could say that is where I got my real start. I was in pre-med when I met her. It wasn't long before I dropped it. I moved to New York for 1 year just to be near Ayn Rand and talk to her. And of course, never went home. That's how I got into the field. Again, as somebody who wasn't raised with philosophy and meets Ayn Rand and discovers that all of the big questions, which he wouldn't necessarily have categorized as philosophy previously, they've got answers. He says, in my 30 years with Ayn Rand, she would ask these questions and nobody knew and nobody cared. And he says, well, Ayn Rand knew and Ayn Rand cared. And imagine that having enough of an impact on you that you say, I've got to go to New York. I'm going to go to New York for a year just to be able to spend time with this amazing thinker.
Well, he had an opportunity. His first cousin was attending UCLA in Los Angeles along with her boyfriend. and they had gotten to know Ayn Rand when she was still living in Hollywood, and they would go out and visit Ayn Rand's cool, which Richard Neutra designed home, and have long discussions with her. And when Leonard Peikoff came to Los Angeles to visit his cousin, he got an opportunity to actually meet Ayn Rand. His plan at the time was to go be a physician like his father was, and like his brother became. His brother actually also became a doctor, a medical doctor, and practiced in Los Angeles very successfully for many years too. So he just figured medicine was the field for him. But that first meeting with Ayn Rand left such a huge impression upon him that it changed his entire perspective on philosophy. And when Ayn Rand moved to New York City, and he had a chance to move to New York City and get to know her still better, it became clear to him that medicine was not the field for him. Philosophy was the field for him. There were answers. See, he didn't even think that there were answers to these questions. There was a theory practice dichotomy. It was his first question to Ayn Rand at her home, about, the moral versus the, he seems like a moral guy, but he also seems like a practical guy. What's the deal there? And starting from those answers that Ayn Rand gave him, he began to realize philosophy was the most important topic, and one he wanted to study.
And just from the extra details that you're adding in, of course, and now I'm making all of these connections. It's interesting that Ayn Rand's father was a pharmacist, a Jewish pharmacist, and Leonard Peikoff's father was a prominent doctor and happened to be Jewish as well, which of course is purely cultural, has nothing to do with religion in their case. But also the fact that
what's interesting is that they both came from Jewish backgrounds, but their families, although they did perfunctory nods towards their religion and tradition, weren't terribly religious families.
Right. And his mother was a band leader. Well, I think Leonard Peikoff didn't go into music, but not only did he write on aesthetics brilliantly in OPAR, but also, as discussed in some of his lectures, but after he retired, he started a jazz trio. He was a well-practiced enough piano player to perform at, for example, an OCON and other small gatherings. And so his love of music, that he would return to that in retirement.
Oh, it's just one of the funner moments when they did happen was Dr. Peikoff going to the piano and playing for us. No, he was not a concert level pianist. His roommate, when they were studying Objectivism in the 60s at the time, actually was a concert level pianist. But he though enjoys and loves it. And you can just tell the love of music that Dr. Peikoff brings when he plays. It's a great feeling, maybe not concert pianist technique though, but great fun when he hits the piano.
Yeah, well, and I admire that as a complete amateur musician myself. And Leonard Peikoff is a much better piano player than me. I just bat out rock songs on the piano. But again, for me, I'm never going to play professionally. It's purely because I enjoy it. So when we get together, we do jams, we play small clubs, and I have a chance to play keyboards. It's just an end in itself, and I love seeing
awesome.
Leonard Peikoff.
Little note there, you're pretty awesome, Robert.
Well,
I have to say, I'm always impressed.
Thank you very much. Now, I'll take a moment as we wrap up the first question to say, super chats, of course, we're always asking if you have something special you want to say or ask in the chat. And I mentioned that because Shazbot just came in with $9.99 and said, let's see what his question is. Maybe I should have pre-read it. Shazbot always has good questions. On a scale from 1 to 10, how proud would Ayn Rand have been of Dr. Peikoff for writing OPAR? Now, just James, before you give us your insights on that, I've got to say, because I intended to mention this, Leonard Peikoff's crowning achievement, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, having read it, and in fact attended the lectures that preceded it, where we got to read the draft notes. You, of course, got to do that even before it got to our stage. I sometimes think OPAR, any other genius, and it would take a genius, but could have written OPAR, but then you add in the extended courses like objective communication, like objectivism through induction. That to me, well, we'll get to the question of intellectual errors, but that even as much as, or maybe more than OPAR. So to Shazbot's question, what would you say? Scale of 1 to 10, how proud would Ayn Rand have been of Leonard Peikoff for writing OPAR?
on a scale of 10, I guess I have to be objective and say 10, but my first instinct was to say 1,000. Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, is as true a reflection of Ayn Rand's ideas put into a systematic form in a way I think Ayn Rand might have done herself. By this point, Dr. Leonard Peikoff had chewed, absorbed, and understood Ayn Rand's philosophy better than any human being on the planet, without a doubt. And I'm confident in saying that. I'm confident in saying that he stuck to Ayn Rand's views. If it was something that was his own, he did not include it. If it was a thought or a formulation that he thought Ayn Rand might not be comfortable with, he did not include it. He only included things. There is much there that most of it is grounded, and he'll cite the Ayn Rand published material that it's based on: Atlas Shrugged, The Virtue of Selfishness, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, The Romantic Manifesto. But there was a whole body of questions and answers that he and other philosophy students got from Ayn Rand during her lifetime that never appeared in print. And everything you read in OPAR, whether there's a citation to a published Ayn Rand work or not, is an Ayn Rand idea, a concept, a formulation, a connection that he got from Ayn Rand. Even in the organizational matters, he was actually reorganizing lectures that he had done in the 1970s on the philosophy of Ayn Rand, where Ayn Rand had approved the lectures and was in attendance and participated in some of the question and answer periods. But even in the improved organization that he brought in the book over that, even in that, it's clear that he was hewing even closer to the way Ayn Rand would have presented it. Now, Leonard Peikoff, I hate to use a terrible example like Karl Marx, but Leonard Peikoff did more for Ayn Rand than Engels did for Marx, by far. It's a more radical philosophy. He was much more systematic in doing this. It's not the sort of, Ayn Rand could have knocked this out of the park, obviously, in her own way, but she had said it, and in her own mind, she basically explained it. But if she were ever to have done a treatise, the closest thing I can imagine would be Dr. Leonard Peikoff's monumental Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. As you say, in the years before it came out, I was privileged to go to Leonard Peikoff's house on Saturday nights, where we would discuss the book chapter by chapter as he was putting the finishing editing touches on it. Outside of reading Atlas Shrugged, that was the most intellectually electric experience of my entire life.
I can only imagine. Well, I don't have to imagine too much, because I did at least get to hear those lectures on the first 5 chapters. Incidentally, all of that, which we all traveled across many miles and spent many dollars to attend, is now available on the internet. And maybe I'll add that to the list of links that I posted earlier. Incidentally, in the chat, Jeff Bannister, he's done this before and he's done it again. He just gifted 5 YouTube memberships. And
Wow.
See the names of the people who received those. That's fun. So those folks will have a month free to just enjoy the extra content that's available via the YouTube membership, ARCUK, as well as some of the fun stuff like the extra emojis that are available. That's super sweet. And thank you for that, Jeff. We appreciate your support. Let me just read the last bit of the answer here on that first question, when Leonard Peikoff says, because this is interesting, he says, the turning point for Leonard Peikoff was when I was reading Charles Peirce. He wrote a statement about the evolution of the universe, and I never forgot the sentence. And you can tell if you listen to the audio, he's quoting this from memory. In the beginning, infinitely remote, there was a chaos of unpersonalized feeling, which, being without connection or regularity, would properly be without existence. And Leonard Peikoff says, when I first read that, I thought, well, this is a profundity that I just can't get. And let me stop from Leonard's quote there. And my immediate reaction is, this is nonsense that nobody should read, but
can anyone really get it?
But people do these things for reasons, and I can't imagine what the reason, but Leonard Peikoff shares with us. He says Ayn Rand interpreted it not only philosophically, but also as introspection on his part, what he was at the beginning of this chaos of depersonalized feeling. He didn't have any sense of self. He didn't have any sense that he counted. And this is what he was writing. In any event, I always remember thinking these people can be understood and debunked and refuted. And why, therefore, should I stay out of this field?
That's amazing. That's amazing. Charles Peirce, of course, is considered the founder of the one school of American philosophy that academics basically recognize, pragmatism. And of course, the great successors like William James and John Dewey and Sidney Hook, who came after him, were part of the academic tradition that Dr. Peikoff basically studied and inherited in American philosophy.
It's interesting because we'll sometimes talk about the primacy of consciousness, kind of, at least I will sometimes do this, kind of intrinsically or remote as just ideas. And to hear a philosopher write, in the beginning, infinitely remote, there was a chaos of unpersonalized feeling. And I know the objectivists will jump right in and say, feeling, if it was in the beginning, who was there to feel the feeling?
Who's feeling what, right? About what?
It doesn't get much more explicitly primacy of consciousness to say that even before there was anybody to be conscious, there was this chaos and this feeling. And
what a confession of, like Ayn Rand says, what a confession of subjectivism on his part, right? I mean, radical subjectivism on his part. It was total chaos. And
yes,
for him, it was, in effect, a universe created by his consciousness.
It's one thing to say, you know, at the moment I feel a little lost or confused. It's another thing to say, no, the root of the universe is loss and confusion.
Confusion is the basis of the universe.
Just amazing. So let me jump to question number 2 here, because these are all related. Leonard Peikoff was asked, when you were in graduate school, how did you choose your supervisor? What qualities were important to you? And Leonard Peikoff says, well, only one, because I didn't expect a lot out of the education. The only one was that I would not be penalized for my ideas. I considered only 2 programs, Columbia and New York University, and I was told flat out by people connected with Columbia that it doesn't matter what your work is here, you will not be graduated by Columbia. This was, by the way, in the 1950s. 1950s. We think things are so corrupt now, you know, things keep getting worse, but even in the 1950s, that was going to be held against you, the fact that you were an explicit, outspoken objectivist. And then Leonard goes on, but Sidney Hook, who we all know was his advisor for his PhD, who was the chairman of the philosophy department at NYU, was noted as a champion of free speech and as an opponent of communism. Of course, he was an ardent socialist. He was also a very close disciple and associate of John Dewey, perhaps the closest that there was. So it was a mixed bag, but he always stood for free speech. And in my experience, he was 100% true to that. He wouldn't let anyone in the philosophy department penalize me for my ideas. He said to me several times how much I was like him in class. When he went to class, everyone was a capitalist but him. When I went to class, everybody was a socialist but me. So he liked the idea that he was a rebel and I was a rebel. He was 100% against objectivism, but he was completely fair to me. And his idea was that I would grow out of objectivism someday. Several times he made indications that he would get me good jobs if only I would grow up, which I didn't. So it's extremely fortunate that that happened. And I couldn't help but see the parallels today.
Well, in New York City, the 2 top universities, certainly the 2 top philosophy programs in New York City, Columbia University and New York University, they still have outstanding philosophy programs. NYU may have the leading philosophy program in North America in any university. So really, he had 2 outstanding choices for philosophy departments, and they were both in Manhattan, right in the heart of New York City. But those were the main choices. And that, later on, what's interesting is that both Harry Binswanger and Alan Gotthelf, the late Alan Gotthelf, who, when he died, was the outstanding academic authority on Aristotle's history as a scientist. I am not exaggerating. The late Alan Gotthelf was probably the most widely cited and respected authority on Aristotle as a scientist in the academic world. Both Gotthelf and Dr. Gotthelf, Professor Gotthelf and Dr. Binswanger got their PhDs from Columbia, but that was in the 60s, at a later time. At this point, Columbia probably would not have allowed Dr. Peikoff the opportunities that Sidney Hook at least made possible for him. Sidney Hook began life as a Marxist, of course, became a critic of the Soviet Union and communism, very famously, but was pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool socialist until much, much later in his life. But he was also the leading protege and student of John Dewey, the father of progressive education, the leading exponent of the American School of Pragmatism, and Sidney Hook was most definitely a pragmatist about this. But he was an unconventional guy who was often out of step in his own background, and so he appreciated NYU's principle of one of the reasons I went to NYU is because they had a principle of free speech and open discussion, being open to ideas. And I found much the same experience. My philosophy professors never graded me down because I included Ayn Rand in my thought. And this is still true, I hope, to some degree, of NYU's philosophy department. Sidney Hook was an advocate of free speech, but he was hopeless in ever trying to understand objectivism. He himself wrote a critique of one of Ayn Rand's books, had no clue what Ayn Rand was up to. He was baffled by a real philosopher doing real philosophy, because it wasn't the the academic word games that philosophy had come to consist of. He couldn't even recognize Ayn Rand as a philosopher. But you see, Leonard Peikoff also had opportunities to go down. He had a very distinguished PhD advisor and a good PhD. He did outstandingly well, by the way, in school. And so he had all kinds of opportunities that that Professor Hook could have given him in the academic world. He could have become, if he compromised his ideas, perhaps a prominent academic professor at a great university. But no, he chose integrity, he chose truth, he chose his devotion to that truth that he understood above the career opportunities that a distinguished mentor from, I can't really call him a mentor, distinguished PhD advisor, at least from NYU, might have afforded him. Speaks to Leonard's integrity.
Yes, yes. Before I jump into question number 3, Bonnie Bertrand is in the super chat with $5, supporting the ARCUK. Thank you so much for that, Bonnie. And she says, she's very complimentary. What a pleasure to hear 2 rational thinkers have this conversation. Thank you so very, very much.
Yes,
Bonnie, thank you for that. And with this subject, it's hard not to put good stuff out there. And for that reason, I want to jump right to question number 3, because this has been controversial. Okay, we've done the easy part so far, but Leonard Peikoff was asked, actually, it's going to sound easy, but there has been controversy. What does it mean to be an intellectual heir? Which is what Ayn Rand called you. Again, they're asking Leonard Peikoff this. Is it important that there always be an intellectual heir for her work? What if the claim is interrupted? Can it be reinstated?
I'm
now,
sorry.
I hear you laughing.
I study the history of Christianity, and what this reminds me of nothing so much of as the principle of apostolic succession. The popes of the Roman Catholic Church believe that they're the direct successors of St. Peter, who, according to the Gospels in the New Testament, got the special authority from Jesus himself. And so it was necessary for them to have this succession, this apostolic succession that comes right down from Jesus' own disciples and from Jesus himself. Jesus gave Peter the keys to the kingdom and so forth. And so you need a pope. You need in effect, what they're asking here is, is it important that we have apostolic succession straight from Ayn Rand? Right. Just like the popes do in the Catholic Church.
History is so strange. It sounds impossible. And then you remember the divine right of kings and how royalty is family succession. In a country like America, where we have elections, and I know most places do now, but
and who cares who your grandfather was? What does that have to do with your virtue?
Individual. But if that line is broken, civilization will collapse.
Right.
So Leonard Peikoff gives a great answer here, and maybe this will surprise some people. He says, all that meant is Ayn Rand's way of saying, well, Peikoff knows my ideas better than anyone else. So take him as my philosophic spokesman. Now, that doesn't mean she's giving an endorsement in advance to anything I say, but simply from what I know, he's less likely to misinterpret objectivism than anyone else. And in that sense, my philosophy is in his hands. It's like a parallel to being a legal heir. My property is in his hands. It means only that. And you ask if it's important that there always be one. No. Farther in time from the source, the less important, because the more written material there is, the more it's understood. There's no guardian necessary or possible. Imagine if today we had an intellectual heir of Aristotle saying, well, this is Aristotle and this isn't. So there's no problem if the chain, and got quotation marks here, if the chain is interrupted. This is not the Catholic Church. So there's your reference there. Objectivism is not dogma, and I am not the Pope.
Boom. Mic drop.
Moreover, I'm not leaving any heir. It's up for grabs. Thanks very much.
No. In fact, in my view, it wouldn't tolerate such a thing. The mind is an individual thing. We all have to come to our own understanding in our own way. Yes. And the first part of Dr. Peikoff's answer is vital here. There is an important oral tradition in addition to the written tradition from Ayn Rand. And the two most important figures who have been transmitting that because they knew Ayn Rand as philosophers are Harry Binswanger and then by far Leonard Peikoff, because Leonard Peikoff by far had the best and longest opportunity to discuss these things with Ayn Rand. He would go to university, study philosophy, getting his bachelor's, his master's, his PhD, writing a 2-volume PhD dissertation on the history of philosophy. As he's going through this entire educational process, he'd get all kinds of confusions at school, and he'd come back to Ayn Rand with his regular meetings with Ayn Rand, and she would spend hours undoing the damage, in effect, that university education and philosophy was doing to him. He knew her longer in this regard than just about anyone. Over 30 years of philosophical discussions with her. He published essays in her magazines, the Objectivist newsletter and the Objectivist. He became an associate editor of the Objectivist and of the Ayn Rand letter later. His lecture course on objectivism in the mid-1970s was the only one that got Ayn Rand's full endorsement as the best expression of her ideas. When Dr. Leonard Peikoff published his first book, The Ominous Parallels, she wrote the introduction, declared it to be the first book written by an objectivist philosopher other than herself. And in her will, she named Dr. Leonard Peikoff her heir, leaving him all of the literary rights to all of her published and unpublished written material. So there can be no doubt that he is, if the term intellectual heir means anything, he is Ayn Rand's intellectual heir, the one that Ayn Rand trusted most to carry on his legacy. And he did, through his lectures and his books, get out that oral tradition that he got directly from Ayn Rand. That is a unique, once-in-a-lifetime experience. If you didn't have extensive discussions with Ayn Rand and have something new to add in that regard, I don't see any need for that kind of intellectual leadership anymore. It's now up to each and every one of us in our individual minds to come to our own decisions on these matters and to understand Ayn Rand as best as we can. In that sense, the rest of us are all just students of objectivism.
Yeah. Who is in a position to do what Leonard Peikoff has done? And I think it's somebody who is, maybe as brilliant. You mentioned Harry Binswanger, but Harry Binswanger's project is not at all what Leonard Peikoff's has been. Harry is a first-hand thinker. He's taking these ideas and giving us more to work on, more to think about. Think of the book How We Know, but he's not speaking for Ayn Rand.
Oh.
He was a kindred spirit of Ayn Rand's during her last few years, but he didn't engage with Ayn Rand the way Leonard Peikoff did.
Not nearly to the extent that he did, but I do love his stories about Ayn Rand, playing Scrabble with Ayn Rand or something, or having a philosophical discussion. And I mean, he at least has those moments. He could tell us, for example, as he recently did in an ARCUK video about Ayn Rand's experience with Professor John Hospers. He was a witness to that himself. So when he describes interactions he had with Ayn Rand, that's invaluable in my mind. But still, Leonard Peikoff by far had the longest period of time and the most and closest interaction with Ayn Rand over more than 30 years.
Yes, and I absolutely respect everything about Harry Binswanger. If you're not part of his HBL, his Harry Binswanger list, you need to be, both for the content of the forum that he runs, but also the Sunday morning discussions, meeting of the minds. But I think of Harry more the way I would think of Alan Gotthelf. He's brilliant. He's a great writer. He's just, Leonard Peikoff did something that nobody else is ever going to do again. And in that regard, incidentally, left out of this book, out of this collection, but if you catch the audio version, Leonard Peikoff was asked a follow-up question, something along the lines of, well, you said that the heir is up for grabs. How can you say that? Why do you think there shouldn't be a designated heir? And Leonard Peikoff says, it might sound immodest, which maybe is why they left it out of the book. But he said, my answer to that is 4 words. Nobody I know qualifies. And I don't think it's a dig. I think it's just a simple truth. Who else could or even needs to fill that role?
No one could do it. But he just had this unique experience that no one else did. You know, the group of students of Ayn Rand's who surrounded her in the years before Atlas Shrugged, after The Fountainhead, which had given her international fame, but before Atlas Shrugged, when Ayn Rand moved to New York City, a group of students followed her. Leonard Peikoff was the philosopher. You know, you had economists, psychologists, you know, a variety of different people with academic or professional interests. Leonard Peikoff was the philosopher. And so he really, in a sense, Ayn Rand focused on him and discussions with him in a way that none of the other students, you know, from her earliest generation of students, had quite the same opportunity Leonard did to get it from the source herself.
Yes. Huge shout out to the chat, because Nick Bruno is in with a $10 super chat just to thank you, supporting the organization, and
thank you.
Very much appreciated there. Also, there's a comment in the chat where Tom Koziol says, well, I bought Keeping It Real just because of this series. If more people are buying this collection because of this series, the gratitude is mine. Thank you for that. Now, it's interesting because Leonard Peikoff, one of his personal challenges in understanding these ideas was keeping them grounded to facts. And he talks about this in the next question. But it's interesting going into this, knowing this is the man who released the series Objectivism Through Induction, and eventually was reprinted as a volume, and absolutely deserves to be. It is a tome worth reading. Well, he was asked, well, what steps did you take to overcome your early rationalist tendency? And he says, I had to understand all of the ramifications of the issue thoroughly, and then practice uprooting it for years, replacing it with a reality orientation. Then he mentions a story about when he was writing The Ominous Parallels. He says, I just automatically assumed that every chapter had defined an axiom that was incontestable, and then deduce the pre-Nazi condition from that axiom. So I deduced the rise of Hitler from the principle that controls breed controls, which, you know, I took out of the blue, but it seemed obvious. And there was a memorable night where Ayn Rand read the chapter, and she looked at me and wondered what I was doing. I thought the chapter was really well written, and I couldn't understand why she didn't think it was great. We were utterly baffled. And then it started to come out that I was coming at things from a totally different way. And she would say things like, well, if controls breed controls, then how would there be periods of deregulation? And that stopped me totally. I hadn't thought of that. These were facts. Having a deductive experience. And then he goes through in detail the process of how she would get him to ground himself in facts, the actual facts, boots on the ground, the facts of reality. But it's interesting to me that he did that not only through working with Ayn Rand, but he says by practice. You know, when Leonard Peikoff talks about the art of thinking, he doesn't say the science of thinking. Thinking isn't a science. That's just the beginning. It is an art. It is a skill. It is something you don't learn by reading. You learn it by doing.
Doing.
And
You know,
that to me is kind of,
it's impossible. I would highly, for an understanding of this concept, rationalism, and a description of the rationalist empiricist syndromes, I would suggest that everyone read the book or take the course Understanding Objectivism by Dr. Leonard Peikoff, which I was privileged enough to take live in New York City in 1983 and actually participate in the course in. It describes the syndrome. Now, objectivists use the terms in a little different sense than, say, the term, you go to philosophy course classes in university, they tell you there's the rationalist school, you know, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, versus the empiricist school, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. And it's true that it has connections to that, but we use it in a particular sense. And that course and book are the upshot of Dr. Leonard Peikoff's long efforts to understand this. Religion has left, and Kant has left, and contemporary philosophy has left a whole wreckage of psychoepistemology in people's minds. It's how they think more than anything. Even secular people who claim to be atheists will still be trapped in modes of thinking that come from religion or Kant. And it is almost impossible to go through a university education, especially in the humanities, and especially in philosophy, without coming out a rationalist. When Dr. Leonard Peikoff wrote his PhD dissertation, he had to impress Sidney Hook and a panel of professors that he knew how they did philosophy, how they approached it, their methodology, what would impress them. And in the process of doing that, it simply corrupts your mind. Your method of thinking, your method of writing, your method of communicating as such is going to be affected by that. And it did affect him. Not only the culture at large, but particularly getting an education at the university level in philosophy gave him all kinds of bad mental habits that he had to get out of. And it took Ayn Rand's approach to philosophy is so radical down to the very methodology of her thinking that he had to sort of clean the slate completely, start all over, and understand objectivism as Ayn Rand did from the ground up. This is one of the things that Ayn Rand did not particularly get into in her own writing, for example, because it's an underlying psychoepistemological method. Now, she'd had these syndromes worked out in her head, at least by the 1960s, if not earlier. In my book, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, you can read Ayn Rand discussing the rationalist empiricist syndromes in this same way as early as the 1960s. But nonetheless, when Leonard Peikoff was writing, he announced his first book, The Ominous Parallels, and he said it was only a few years off, and we just had to keep waiting and waiting and waiting. And one of the major reasons why it took so long is that the story he tells. I mean, Ayn Rand read a chapter and said, "What? Why did you write this? What is it? I don't even get what this." When you get an answer like that, here Leonard thought, "Okay, I've done it. I've knocked it out of the park. This is a great chapter. Ayn's going to be so proud of me and impressed." And he goes in, and Ayn says, "Where are you? Wow, why'd you even write this? Where are you coming from?" He realized that they're still talking on different wavelengths, and that he has to understand her whole approach. And you're absolutely right. The upshot of that approach is his objective communication course, which, by the way, we're doing on Sundays through Ayn Rand Center UK for subscribers. We're going through Leonard Peikoff's objective communication course, where he really breaks down how the process of trying to communicate objectivism helped derationalize him. Working with Ayn Rand on that book over the years helped enormously in undoing that. But you have to go from the ground up to fix a psychoepistemological problem like that. And you're right, the climax of this, the art of thinking, objectivism through induction in philosophy and physics. These courses put the final finishing touches on any remnant of rationalism that remained in Leonard Peikoff's mind, so that now he is not only trained as an academic philosopher would have been trained properly, but now he actually understands Ayn Rand methodologically, how she went about thinking, how she understood her own principles. And in this regard, Leonard Peikoff is unexcelled. He is without a doubt, the leading living authority on Ayn Rand's philosophy and how she thought.
Yeah, he wraps up his answer with recommendations of both understanding objectivism and objective communication. I immediately went in my head to objectivism through induction, but maybe that was a rationalist tendency
Oh,
on
no, no,
my
no.
part.
Induction, remember how he describes it there. Rationalism, in part, is the idea that we can deduce everything and deduce everything from axioms.
Yes.
That is part of the methodological trap we call rationalism, right? When you, by the best way, the only way to undo that kind of rationalism and still, without throwing out the logic is the baby with that bathwater, is
Right.
through induction. And so all these induction courses are the crowning achievements, in effect, the outcome of Dr. Leonard Peikoff's having conquered rationalism in his own psychoepistemology.
Yes. A tip I would give on a lower level, and some of this is coming up in the chat discussing social media, is in having conversations with people who aren't objectivists. I watch how different people approach these conversations, and the worst version of it is precisely trying to come up with that logic bomb, that logical argument that is going, it's basically like, that's how I'm going to own this guy, own my opponent. This is how I'm going to look real good, and convince him, in 5 minutes, what it took me 2 years of studying objectivism to learn. And my approach is more, I think, more along the lines of planting seeds, put the information out there, including the logic, but the facts on which it's based. And you're still going to disagree with me at the end of the conversation, but now you've got something to walk away with, something to think about. But yes, that idea of owning your opponent is, we get a little bit of that.
And deductive logic makes us think, well, gosh, I can really corner them. If they accept my definition, then I can use a few deductive inferences, and boy, I've cornered my opponent, and there's no wiggle room out. But of course, that's totally deceptive. Our deductions are only as valid as the abstractions, the universal premise that they start out with. And that can only be validated from observation up by induction. And so no deduction can be any more valid than the inductive process of coming to the general premise. You're never going to corner your opponent just with deduction. It may feel like, oh boy, I've got him cornered. I've got him down to denying that 1 + 1 = 2 here, because you've accepted this dichotomy between logical, valid truth and factual, empirical truth. One of the great essays I recommend from Dr. Leonard Peikoff is his revolutionary essay, The Analytic Synthetic Dichotomy, which appears as an index. Ayn Rand herself included it as an index to her book on epistemology, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Revolutionary, groundbreaking, and gets to the philosophical basis for this rationalist empiricist dichotomy, which Leonard Peikoff has done more to destroy than anyone but Ayn Rand herself through her own art and work. He came to understand those things as a syndrome, Ayn Rand's unique methodology that got her to objectivism, how she thought.
Last time we talked about Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, I shared with you that really was the essay. And I have a signed copy of ITOE with Leonard Peikoff's signature in it. And he said, well, I usually only sign books that I wrote. And I told him, no, your essay on the analytic synthetic dichotomy, if people say, well, what was the one thing that convinced you objectivism was true? That was the one that answered the last few philosophic confusions I had. That's the one that put me over the edge. So we did a whole episode, you and I, on the analytic synthetic dichotomy. Yeah. Folks can look that up on YouTube. And speaking of Leonard Peikoff teaching us philosophy, the last question here. When you were a college professor, did you mention Ayn Rand to your students? Or did you just teach from an objectivist perspective? What kind of impact do you think you had on your students? And no surprise, Leonard Peikoff says, I taught objectively, but not from an objectivist perspective, because I was not hired as an objectivist. Well, the way I typically did it was to give the students a choice of positions on an issue with the arguments for and against. I would then have them write a paper telling me which one of the various positions they thought was the most rational and how they answered the arguments from the others. For instance, I taught God, the arguments for and against faith. and then for and against atheism, and then the arguments for and against agnosticism. I love how he regards that as a third position, because later, of course, he talks about the irrationality of agnosticism. What is there that you don't know when you claim you're an agnostic? Sorry, going on with the answer, he says, then when I gave the papers back, I went out of my way to announce at least one A for each category so that there was no feeling of prejudice. I like that too, because it sounds kind of rationalistic. I'll put an A out there whether they deserve it or not. But he's really just making sure that his own opinion isn't affecting his grading there. At that point, and only then, did I indicate that what my view was and how I would have answered the others, and that this was Ayn Rand's view. If anyone wanted to talk about it, I was happy to meet them in the office. So I got the message out to whoever was interested. Most people only wanted the grade, but some did come to the office. And in that way, I mentioned Ayn Rand, but I did not proselytize.
And as a college professor, you have a subject matter to teach. He was teaching things like the history of Western philosophy or teaching logic, important prerequisites for every philosophy student to take. It won't let you get a philosophy degree without taking courses like that. But when you teach courses like that, you have a definite subject matter. The history of Western philosophy or the rules of logic. And when you're teaching courses like that, there's an actual content subject matter. It can be taught objectively, right? But, it's not objectivism you were hired to teach. Now, there came a point in the 1960s where he was able to give a university course, one of the very first, if not the first university courses on Ayn Rand and the study of objectivism. But that was a course on objectivism. Now, if that's included in the subject matter and the syllabus of the course that the college is offering, then, of course, part of it is to study Ayn Rand and her philosophy. But otherwise, you've got a subject matter to teach. So you can't be teaching objectivism. You've got to be teaching objectively. And there's a big distinction there in my mind. Now, he did take the opportunity, like he said, even then, if there were particularly interested students in office hours or something, well, what is your answer to, you're asking us to think about these answers. What is your answer, Dr. Peikoff? He would then say, I would recommend that you read Ayn Rand. This would be my answer. And he had a really good reputation, actually. I mean, I said this many times and I will say it again. I've had outstanding teachers in my time, really good teachers at law school, as an undergraduate, even before that in high school, and informally. How many good teachers have I had? But by far, just in terms of pedagogical skills, Dr. Leonard Peikoff is the best teacher I have ever had. He embodies, as you can get in his courses on objective communication or logic, he will himself use himself as the foil for the error. Well, this is the error I committed, but he will always then embody the example that he's trying to exemplify, the principle that he's trying to teach. So if in objective communication, he's saying the importance of motivating your audience, he will start out with this giant motivation to get people to care, why it matters, why you should care. Or if he'll say it's important to concretize with examples. For example, and then he'll give two key examples, even as he's doing that. He is a reflection of the very principles that he teaches, a kind of honesty and integrity I have never known in a teacher. That is why Dr. Leonard Peikoff is my teacher and mentor.
Yes.
He taught me how to think and to communicate. It's just that simple.
Now, I'm a little bit jealous of students who would have had Leonard Peikoff as a philosophy professor, because as much as I've enjoyed his lectures, and when you see him live, the passion is there.
Right.
He does point out that, it's hard to tell with his students what impact he had. He'd occasionally get letters, but he says, the only thing I can say in all modesty is that my classes were usually jam-packed, so people were eager to hear, but I don't know whether it was because of the content or because I made a point of keeping them awake. Now, if you've seen Leonard Peikoff speak live, you know what his style is. He's very engaged with the ideas, but it's usually the ideas are the passion. Now, listen to this when he was teaching in the university. And he says, well, I had all kinds of tricks. I would make them laugh just because it kept them awake. Or I would go to the back of the room and lecture to the back of their heads so they couldn't fall asleep because they didn't know what I was doing. They got the feeling that it wasn't boring. I don't know whether it was that ideology, influence, or something else. It's hard to tell the impact of writing. If you're a surgeon, you can tell the impact of seeing. Does the patient get better or not? With a lawyer, does the client get off or not? But with a philosopher, it is, well, does the civilization survive or not? Who lives long enough to find that out? You never really know in philosophy whether you got anywhere or not. That's one of the real problems of philosophy. Imagine Aristotle wouldn't know until the 13th century AD that he influenced.
Begin to understand the influence of Aristotle until the 13th century.
Yes. And Leonard Peikoff wraps up by saying, well, that's a long time to wait. but I am jealous of the kids, adults, but young adults sitting in Leonard Peikoff's classes. He's playing these tricks. I would almost call them shenanigans, but there's clever ways of keeping the students engaged.
Having studied philosophy at the university level, I can tell you that I sat around a bunch of students who were bored or confused or both, or their eyes were glazing over, or they were just checking their watches for how quickly the lecture would end. I was one of the one or two students in the class, front row, leaning forward, but only because Ayn Rand had taught me the importance of philosophy. I grasped the life and death consequences, the historical ramifications, the impact on my own life. And so I was burning interest, leaning forward in the front row. But I can tell you 90% of the students in university philosophy classes, they think it's first of all, they've been taught philosophy is a useless thing, a waste of time, meaningless word games. And to a large extent, they're true. That's a true impression when they go to university and study philosophy. But even that, because I understood the evil and impact of it, kept me interested. But you get a lot of yawns and who cares? But Dr. Leonard Peikoff could have been a stand-up comic in my mind. He always says, I'm terrible at telling prepared jokes. He'll say, I just am lousy at telling prepared jokes. He said that many times. I think he has one of the sharpest, driest, most powerful, risible wits I've ever heard in my life. He keeps the audience engaged, entertained, motivated. He gets them to care about the topic. He will do everything he can to do that. That's one of the reasons that makes him such a great teacher. He brings the lecture alive. He makes it relevant. He gets them to think. He gets them to participate in the thinking. Really, the most extraordinary teacher I've ever known.
Yes. It brings to mind the Ayn Rand in Philosophy, Who Needs It? When she says, well, you might object that, why should I study this stuff if it's nonsense and I know that it's nonsense? And her answer to her own hypothetical question is, it is nonsense, but you don't know it.
And that's a very exact answer.
hearing that certainly hit with me,
Yes.
And she says, not so long as you can't refute it, or so long as you go on, saying things that are based on those ideas that you think they're wrong.
Well, I just have to. That's exactly it. It's who is it who said, it's not what we don't know that's the problem. It's it's what we do know that just ain't so. That's the problem. Yes. And that often does tend to be the case. What got me through being an undergraduate, and I did very well. I graduated magna from NYU with a degree in philosophy. I wish I could take all the credit for myself, but I had either just taken Leonard Peikoff's taped lecture courses on the history of philosophy or logic. And so I came in to my undergraduate philosophy courses armed for bear, as there were.
An unfair advantage.
Leonard Peikoff's, and if it weren't for those taped lecture courses I was taking from Leonard Peikoff about philosophy, I don't know that I could have had such a breeze of a time through university. I would definitely do the work and show that I'd mastered the assigned material that the professors wanted us to do, but I always, just about always included, sometimes it may not have been relevant, but I almost always included Ayn Rand or citations for Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff right there in my papers, and I was never downgraded for it. It was something extra, it was something added, but it was Leonard Peikoff and his courses and his teaching that really made my own undergraduate experience in philosophy what I would say a comparative breeze.
Well, that's practically like having the answer key or peeking in the back of the book.
The answer's at the back of the book.
Well, James, thank you very much. This has been a great discussion, and I love anything to do with Leonard Peikoff. If you haven't seen the videos that I mentioned earlier, take a look in the show notes or on my Facebook wall, and you will see a list of them because the ARCUK has been host to some great ones, and some others are out there in my list as well. My 30 Years with Ayn Rand is, of course, irresistible.
That's the one I was going to recommend. If you really are interested in Dr. Peikoff's relationship with Ayn Rand, the best source for that is his amazing speech, My 30 Years with Ayn Rand.
Yes, and he subtitles it An Intellectual Memoir. You can find more of the personal stories about Leonard Peikoff in various places in his writing, but the intellectual memoir, the power of his own life course, being an associate of Ayn Rand, and of course he gets into the real stuff that hits you in the heart by the end of the story as well.
Oh, yeah. I can't not cry when I read or listen to that.
It is, but there's so much good content out there. You know, if folks can still find that DVD, Leonard Peikoff in his own words, that's a hard one to find. I'm happy to have a copy of that on the shelf as well. If you want a little more of the personal side of Leonard Peikoff, do you know if there's any chance that's going to be re-released?
I have no idea, but it should be. It should be. And we should re-release the interview that my wife and I did with Dr. Leonard Peikoff in the 1990s for Ideas in Action. There is material out there about Leonard Peikoff himself, and I think it should be made.
I'll do some poking around, see if I can find out who's got the rights to those and if there's any chance of them being released to the internet or at least put up for sale again. Yeah. Good stuff. James, thank you for another outstanding discussion. I love the fact that you decided, you know, would you spend a little time with the guy who wrote the book, the guy who ran the podcast that produced these hundreds, I think beyond the published ones, thousands of answers. It's amazing that they're so good.
The founder of our feast.
It really is extraordinary. We're going to continue next week as we get closer to Thanksgiving with a question related to the holiday. I've been doing some gratitude exercises both on my shows and online.
Yes. Good thing. I love those posts you're doing, good things, and reminding us that there's all kinds of good things in this world.
I love seeing this. This is becoming bigger and bigger in objectivism because, you know, Jean Maroney incorporates Martin Seligman's 3 things in some of her exercises. Now Tal Stefani's bringing it into his happiness teams. So yeah, I couldn't resist doing that for the month of Thanksgiving. But next week, and I know you've already chosen the question we're going to do, I'll keep it a surprise for now, but we're going to talk Leonard Peikoff and Thanksgiving. James, thank you for an outstanding discussion.
Thank you again, Robert. Always great.